Hello, everyone. Wonderful to have you all with us. I'm Paul Chatterton. I lead the Landscape Finance Lab based in Vienna, Austria. And I'm going to give you a very short introduction to holistic landscape restoration. And I hear you've gone through some great case studies on this already. So let's see if... Why? I think the Dasgupta review done by the United Kingdom a year or two ago is well worth looking at, because it gives the story very clearly. Nature sits at the bottom of all human economy. That's the very strong message that it gives, and we're eating our way out of house and home. According to WWF, we live as though we have 1.5 planets. Our global consumption patterns don't match up to the productivity of nature's. So the first message that they give is that we have to ensure that demands on nature don't exceed sustainable supply. They're also making a very strong statement that our current reward system in economics rewards production, but not protection and restoration, and that needs to change. So they're proposing that there be an inclusive measure of wealth that accounts for investing in natural assets, that we actually count nature into the picture, and we count the cost of restoring what we take from nature, restoring more than we take from nature. That's critical. And I think one of the really interesting parts of this report is that it says that this has to be a systemic change, that we need to transform our institutions and systems, and that's not an easy message. It's easy to fix a small problem, but to change entire systems is very, very difficult. But that's where we are, and why landscapes is interesting, because landscapes are giving us a different way to look at not just nature but economy, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration kicked off last year, has brought us all together around these challenges, to protect, to revive ecosystems, to rethink how we finance the economies so that nature is a part of that. Okay, that's the big picture. And following the Dasgupta report, we have the wrong tools for the job. That's pretty clear. Our economy is based on projects, and that's why it works so well. Since the Industrial Revolution, or even before that, we've been very good at building farms, at building railways, at developing mines, and so on. We work in a project manner, very, very sectoral, each sector doing its own thing and getting stronger and more effective. But the problem is that as that extends more and more out into the landscape, it undermines the natural systems on which that whole system is based. So working at a project scale works against nature. It's small scale, it's short term, it's sector locked, and it's competitive. And that's the problem. Even conservation projects are projects. Very few are thinking at landscape scale, but thankfully that's changing. So the question is how do we change the tools by which the economy works, as well as conservation? How do we change them so that they work at the scale of nature, at the scale of the ecosystem, and eventually the biome, so that we can actually systematically restore natural systems, bring the climate back into balance, and make sure that our economies can keep producing over generations. The landscape scale gives you the ability to work at that ecosystem level. It allows you to think across generations in a much longer time frame. What's really important about it is that you can integrate different types of activities and make sure that the conflicts that might be created can be avoided. And in fact, you can create synergies and make sure that the whole system is owned locally so that communities benefit, not just the richer industrialists and the financiers. So that's our challenge. That's why we work at landscape scale. And that is changing the entire system and institutions. But the good news is that government, NGOs, business are rethinking how they work at landscape scale, and it's happening quite rapidly. So how does it work? Well, we produced the Little Sustainable Landscape book back in 2015 to look at how to simplify approaches to landscape. So how do we go from the project level up to this landscape level and integrate it into the national? And when we started, there were 80 different definitions for the landscape approach. We pulled them all together and we proposed one single unifying definition. You can read the book to understand that. I won't go into the details of it. But we also found that just about every industrial sector and other sector of production and protection uses the landscape approach, whether it's climate smart agriculture in the food sector, integrated catchment management in the water sector, and so on. They all have a type of landscape approach. And even better, when we looked at it carefully, they were all largely doing the same thing. They were they're basically going through the project cycle through a few steps in building landscapes, but with different contexts, with a different focus. Integrated coastal zone management, it's about looking after the oceans and coasts. Where in this set of workshops, we're looking at forest landscape restoration, and there's a whole set of different tools and methodologies for forest landscape restoration, but we can consider them all under that term, forest landscape restoration, FLR. And just to dig into that, forest, why forest? Well, 50 to 80% of the world's biodiversity lives in forests. A very large amount of the world's population depends directly on forests for their survival and for a significant part of their products. And the purpose here is to increase the number and the health of trees in an area, restore the area, but beyond that, to build back the complexity of forest ecosystems, because they can produce a whole lot more types of products for humans, and they're important in their own right, of course. Why landscapes? Well, landscapes involve watersheds, jurisdictions, biomes. Landscapes allow you to bring many different stakeholders together. They allow you to think about different types of land uses, that mosaic of land uses, and have people think about how to increase the benefit for each other across the whole system. And again, we're finding that the more people work together, the more they grow together, and the benefits grow with them across that landscape. And restoration, that involves bringing back the ecological functionality of an area, getting those diverse benefits, improving resilience, better productivity, better value for the people in the landscape, both in terms of economy and culture, water, and so on. So it's a long-term process over large areas, but it's really important that it shows short-term results. And that's a big challenge as we build forest landscape restoration programs. So just to look at some of those different benefits that can come from thinking at a landscape level. Here's an area in Costa Rica, Monteverde Cloud Forest Reserve. In fact, This was the first place that I saw tropical rainforests. I think I walked into those rainforests, and this is back in the days when it was just film cameras. I took 70 shots in an hour of the rainforest. I was so astonished at the diversity of this place, and it's very well protected now. But they've been looking at the whole area, not just the rainforest, but looking at how to improve productivity across the entire system. So obviously there's the protected area. That's an important source of water. Water helps the farmers. Protecting the water flow helps the farmers. Ecotourism is a big addition to the economy there. In the border areas between farm and forest is shaded coffee and other similar sorts of agroforestry products, and those windbreaks and agroforestry areas provide more habitat for wildlife, corridors that allow migration and so on. And then you've got your production areas, and here it's a matter of focusing on getting more ecological production, getting more quality, getting higher prices, helping with marketing and so on. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the mosaic that we're talking about, linking together different land uses so you get benefits, and particularly the synergies that go from protecting an area, creating water flows for farmers. The farmers can contribute to rebuilding the areas outside of the park and so on, so everyone grows together. The Little Sustainable Landscape book helped us to think about a very simple process for building landscapes, and it's not rocket science. It's just basically the project cycle done by the stakeholders in a landscape. So this row here, the process row, has the 5 elements, what we call the 5 elements. And the idea is that building a landscape, you're thinking for 20 years, for a generation at least, as you build it. And you go through these 5 steps. 1, bringing together the stakeholders, so building a landscape partnership. 2, they come to a common understanding of the problem that needs to be fixed, the values in the landscape, and some of the possible solutions. And they come to an understanding of each other as they go through that as well. They build a vision. They define what it is they want to achieve in the landscape, how they fix that problem, and an action plan for doing that. They get financing and take action, and they set up a monitoring system to measure impact and to learn and to adapt. So just the project cycle plus done by a partnership. And if you do that, you achieve 4 returns. Returns for communities, returns for nature, returns for financial returns, and importantly, the return of inspiration. And you can see the more details on this methodology in our recent report, the 4 returns framework. Sorry, it's blocked there. There we go. I'll move it sideways. The 4 returns framework for landscape restoration that gives you our latest thinking with common land and eco-agriculture partners and others on how to do the landscape approach. And so, the aim is to go from a world where you've got different projects competing with each other to maximize return on income per hectare. And of course, the more you use the land and the more you compete, the more degradation you have. That leads to 4 losses: the loss of purpose or hope, the loss of employment, loss of biodiversity, soil, water, loss of economic activity, and they reinforce each other in a downward spiral. Landscapes, holistic landscape management gives you the chance to create an upward spiral of landscape restoration. More money, more nature, more social benefits, and through that, more hope. And it's actually the hope, the inspiration that drives a landscape forward. That vision of what a landscape might become is actually absolutely critical as we go through building a landscape program. So I might hand over to Lucy Garrett from FAO to to talk about a first example of that in Vanuatu. Lucy.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Hi. This one is going to be an example of how climate finance can be supportive to landscapes at both project scale and also with the sort of long-term goal of scaling up finance and scaling up restoration in Vanuatu. So climate finance has been used here in the Pacific Islands, which has included a project, a 5-year project that provided roughly just over $1 million invested from the International Climate Initiative and Jeff 6, which supported the development of sustainable land management practices of at least 750 hectares, and that included 200 hectares that was completely restored in the Tonga Island by 2022. And this project also, this finance supported at national level the development of the forest and landscape restoration strategy, which really embedded this process of restoration and this long-term objective of improving natural capital for benefits of both ecological function and also social and economic benefits for communities. And building on that, the country, together with FAO, has supported the development of a proposed 5-year project with the Adaptation Fund finance, which is much, much larger. So that's 7.1 million investment, US dollars investment, which aims to build on the initial work and build on this national strategy to restore much larger area of the islands and link all of the agricultural, forestry and other land uses sectors and climate change under a much more integrated approach within this strategy. So this is just a good example of how sort of different financial sources, so from a climate finance source, can be used to have initial finance, but then build much later to develop a much more long-term project with this. And this aims to coordinate restoration efforts to enhance restoration programs across the country, as well as improve coordination between different stakeholders and improve the knowledge across the country about the potential benefits of the restoration methods. And how those can support climate resilient forest and land resource management to protect both coastal and inland ecosystems, obviously being an island state very much being impacted by climate change, and looking at the long-term projection of that. Thanks, Paul.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lucy. And continuing on to Africa and Asia, a couple of further examples. Another forest carbon program that I was involved in when I was in WWF. The lab was born out of WWF. So this is a massive program. It's one province of that's the Democratic Republic of Congo there. It's one province not far from Kinshasa. It takes up about the size of Greece. 13 million hectares is the size of this project. 9 million hectares of rainforest. It contains half of the known extent of the bonobo chimp, the closest animal to human beings, and it's very threatened. But with a lot of work between a lot of stakeholders, a program has now been developed to get carbon payments to act as 15 different organizations who are taking action to protect the forests and restore the forests. You've got money going to community groups who are working with villages that are allowing the savannas to grow back, and that's working really well, I hear. The forest is coming back. Women have to walk less distance to get water and so on. It's paying logging companies to either move out of the area and turn the area into protected areas, or to do reduced impact logging. And it's investing in plantations and forest restoration areas with some plantation companies. So where you had a situation where the forestry industry and communities and NGOs were fighting with each other, now you've got a situation where they need each other to be able to achieve these goals and draw down what's projected as $170 million of investment. It's quite exciting, and there's a couple of these now across the planet. This can be done, this sort of thing can be done without carbon investment as well. And that's, there's an interesting case study, led by Michelin Tire Company, strangely enough, who has a rubber concession in this part of Sumatra. This is, you can see here, Sumatra in Indonesia. This is central Sumatra, a narrow ribbon across the island of forest, which has tigers, orangutan, and elephants. One of the only places where you find those together. And Michelin sourced their rubber from a concession here, 80,000 hectares. And they were worried that they didn't want to see the rainforests being lost and them being blamed for that. They wanted to shift to a more wildlife-friendly and sustainable rubber that they could market at a higher price. And so they worked with WWF, with BNP Paribas, the bank, and Unit Finance Initiative was involved as well to set up what's now a $90 million investment program, and then another tranche is coming of 115 million. And this is to invest in not only sustainable rubber plantations, but also forest restoration areas on the side of the national park, and national park management, better management of the whole system. So again, creating those synergies between the different actors, rather than having a competitive situation where everyone's competing for land and for resources and no one wins. Okay, there's a quick summary of the world of holistic landscape restoration and forest landscape restoration. I hope that's useful, and I'll hand over now to Florian Vernaz in Bali, who's going to give us the next section. Great to talk to you all.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks everyone for being here. So yeah, today we're going to discuss a little bit more into detail after the last session you had on natural capital and valuation of ecosystem services. Today we're going to discuss a little bit more about how we actually bring finance into the landscape, into projects that are commercially and less commercially viable. Maybe before we get into the definitions and some concrete examples of blended finance instruments, it is important to recall the key components of a landscape approach that Paul talked you through a little bit earlier, and to understand how the stakeholder engagement process will actually shape the financing strategy. Yeah? So when you look at a landscape, you will have diverse activities and stakeholders within the same landscape that interact with each other. So you can see the illustration. You will have business farms, you will have smallholder farmers, you will have factories, forest concession, mining, settlements, and so on. So all those different stakeholders, they will have very different objectives, strategies, and incentives. So it is first very important to understand who those key actors in the landscape are and what are the costs of landscape degradation to them, yeah? Because that will impact how you can interact with them, that will impact their likeliness to actually federate around the landscape vision, and to also potentially contribute to the financing of coordinated landscape approaches. Yeah, and by better understanding the incentives and the risks that all of those stakeholders are exposed to, it will also facilitate the articulation of a problem statement and the ability to find entry points to engage those different stakeholders. Yeah, so I think from our experience and all the lessons learned from landscape approach in very different geographies, that ability to actually clearly articulate the problem and to define entry points that can federate stakeholders is really critical. Yeah? To give you an example, Paul was talking about Sumatra a little bit earlier. So you have a lot of degraded peats in Sumatra, and you will have acacia plantation, palm oil plantation, smallholder farmers, and so on, all operating in the landscape. Sometimes difficult to bring them all around the same table, but what is interesting is to see that they are all negatively impacted by peat fires. So the smallholders, they will lose their crops, they will be exposed to health hazard. The companies, they will also suffer losses. The acacia plantations, they have lost a lot of plantation areas through fires. They can also be legally liable if fire open inside their concession. And the government, ultimately, they will have to pay the bill for the damage. So we found out, for example, here that preventing pit fire is a very effective entry point to open the dialogue between different stakeholders, because all of them are exposed to the same risk, and it makes it easier to create a consensus on what the problem is and a vision. Yeah. So then the next step is to come up with a common understanding of the drivers of landscape losses that also Paul touched upon a little bit earlier under the 4 return framework. So what is driving deterioration of the landscape, and how we can address those drivers and turn around things into returns. Yeah. So that's how we can articulate the vision, develop action plan and KPIs, and really understand who would be willing to contribute, have an idea of the different approaches and projects that could be implemented. Then the taking action is really when we get into the mobilization of finance. Yeah, but I think the key point here is that all those steps are necessary and interlinked to be able to develop a coherent and effective financing strategy up to the point where we can actually look at impact and value for money in the next step. Yeah. So yeah, just to give you a little bit of context on why actually we need to go through this process, even when we are focusing on financing. Okay, so we have prepared. I think we have shared in the chat box a link to a shared document. So this is actually the table that you see on the screen here. So we've shared this template basically to ask you to share about the process in your respective landscape, and that will allow you to put your experience into the context of landscape approach and to start highlighting lessons and to share your thoughts. Yeah. So we will allow you maybe for the next 5 minutes to open that shared document. You will be able to simultaneously fill that template, and we will come back together in 5 minutes and maybe call upon a few of you to share a little bit about your experience. So who were the key actors in your landscape? What was the problem? How did you come up with a vision and solutions? And what was the finance solution that actually were mobilized in the landscape? So please have a look and try to open the links. It should hopefully work for everyone. And we will reconvene in approximately 5 minutes. Yeah. Thank you, Vincent. And I think that can be a great example for others to look at. Yeah. So yeah, thanks a lot for sharing, Vincent and Daniel. So I think there is a lot of material to reflect upon. Yeah. Thank you very much. So yeah, I think that brings us to the next point, which is basically what kind of what type of investment are we looking for at landscape level? Yeah. So we have different instruments that will be available based on the scale and needs of specific programs and projects. So when we start looking, for example, at project level with natural-based solutions, so individual projects, we will have a scale that is obviously much lower than if we look at landscape instruments that will aggregate bankable and non-bankable projects at the scale of a landscape. Then if we look at landscape investment funds, I mean, those funds are basically looking at investing across multiple landscapes. So it's even larger in scale. And then we will have thematic funds looking, for example, at investing across landscape, but in very specific areas, focusing, for example, on forest landscape restoration, wash and catchment areas, and energy, for example. What's been interesting also to notice over the past few years is that there has been more and more research actually to demonstrate, for example, that NBS investment, for example, for water catchment, management of hydrological balance can be actually more cost efficient than traditional infrastructure investment. Yeah. When we're looking at different sources of finance, so we will have 3 main categories: philanthropic and government funding, so public funds that will provide grants to projects that are either not in commercial nature, that are not viable, or to fund specific activities of projects to bring them to bankability. Commercial funding, so meaning loans, equity, and so on, will basically allow NBS projects that are able to generate profits to fruition. Result-based payment, we look, for example, at rewarding projects that generate positive outcomes, such as carbon and other SDG component. Yeah. So I think it all brings into light that and makes the link with previous session of that learning series, is that whether you look at result-based payments, commercial investments, or philanthropic investments, you will need to look also at the natural capital and at the impact projects will have on ecosystem services and welfare of the people in the landscape. Yeah. Okay, maybe handing over to Lucy to look at the different degree of risk in different landscape according to the degradation level of those landscapes. Yeah.
Thank you, Florian. So different returns on investment is an indicator for investors to determine if an investment is worthwhile relative to the investment cost. And this is associated with the risk of that return, which is particularly apparent when in relation to restoration of degraded landscapes or reforestation. And a higher risk of investment is associated with a greater probability of a higher return. And a lower risk will be associated with a greater probability of a lower return. So a risk ratio will therefore be used by investors to evaluate the potential return on their investment relative to the amount of risk that they must undertake. So obviously in a higher degraded landscape, there'll be a greater risk to that investment and will make investors a lot more cautious to bring those investments to the table. Different investment sources and mechanisms can therefore be more appropriate for different stages of a restoration project or different areas, different biomes that require different amounts of finance for different elements to their projects. And so depending on the degradation level, the cost of restoration and expected rate of return from investors and expected risks. So for example, where low levels of degradation are apparent, they present lower costs of restoration and therefore the lower risk. And this may be more attractive to more traditional investors such as pension funds or commercial banks, etc. And moving into sort of more moderately degraded landscapes, there will be a slightly increased risk for returns for investors. And this may be where things like, results-based payments, such as payments for ecosystem services may work here. Providing results-based payments, also maybe more crowdfunding or private equity impact funds, etc., and development finance institutions. And where highly degraded landscapes require investment, the investments can be lengthy over long periods of time. I know Paul and Florian have both been talking about the generational time that we need to look at with these projects and these processes for restoration. The costs are high, so public funds may be more applicable here in development banks, which are more likely to be provide investments and take on that risk to investment. So this might be something to consider when looking at your own work about where maybe along the degradation scale or the cost of your restoration, what financing mechanisms or what investors may be more willing to take on the risk associated with your landscape. Thanks, Florian.
Sorry for the mute. Thank you, Lucy. So yeah, now we're going to get a little bit more into the core of today's session. So looking at blended finance. So landscapes will offer opportunities for both bankable and non-bankable projects. Yeah, so for investment in restoration, investment also in projects that can be commercially viable. So we're going to look a little bit more into detail at those bankable projects, see how we can actually finance those projects, how we can engage with private stakeholders and make it interesting for them to get involved in the funding of those projects. Yeah. So in a sense, what blended finance means is that public and private money will be used to incentivize investment in certain projects. So why do we actually need to push the private sector towards certain projects? Because some of those investments will maybe not be commercially viable or attractive enough compared to other investments. Sorry. but they will provide significant impact in terms of job creation, livelihoods, environmental benefits, and so on. So what we need to see here is that the value of the investment, the value of money, will be superior to the financial return. Yeah, so that's why it's important, again, going back to the discussion on natural capital, to look at the total economic value of investment and not to narrow our analysis to financial returns. So the general idea here is that basically blended finance is a way to upgrade non-bankable projects, so projects that in themselves will not be attractive enough for private investor, to provide some kind of a subsidy or additional funding from public sources to make it bankable, so to make it reach commercial viability. So Lucy spoke about a series of risks. So I mean, the idea basically of blended finance is that public sources of finance will allow to address certain challenges for both private investors and public funders. So for private investors, mostly it will be that those projects are either not profitable enough, so it's difficult for them to justify investment in a project that either will not provide benefits or will be less profitable than other investments. So there will be an opportunity cost for them to invest in low return projects, or they will face a level of risk that basically make it difficult for them to take the investment decision. It's interesting also to notice here that historically, there has been very little incentive or mandate for private sector to invest in a nature-based solution. It has been true, the incentive structure is changing. Now there are more and more businesses that are interested in investing in nature-based solution because they have more, more push towards net zero commitments, Scope 3 emission reduction, but also other SDGs target. So that incentive is moving a little bit from return on investment to triple bottom line. Yeah? But still, it's important to give an additional push to make sure that those projects that are maybe less attractive financially or that are perceived are too risky can be provided with additional funding to either increase the level of return or to de-risk a little bit the investment. So for public funders, the challenges is a bit different, is that for governments and jurisdictions to reach their SDG targets, their NDC targets, the amount of public funding available will most of the time not be sufficient to actually reach their target. I think there's been a lot of literature about the need to mobilize private finance to invest in carbon emission reduction, but also in other SDGs, livelihood, access to water, and so on. So using private investment is critically important for governments to be able to provide positive impact in specific landscape. Yeah. So the idea here is that public investment can be used not to solve all the problem by itself, but to attract more investment. So the idea behind blended finance is that public finance will allow to increase the amount of private investment flowing into specific projects or landscapes. Most of the restoration projects also historically have been funded through grants and philanthropy, which usually are shorter term in nature. So they will go for a period of 3, 4, 5 years, while the financing need for restoration, as Paul mentioned earlier, is generational. It's a need for a long period over 20, 25 years. So there is a mismatch between philanthropic investment and conservation needs and restoration needs on the ground. So one other consideration that needs to be taken into account by public funders is that subsidies and public finance should not create market distortions. So basically investment in specific sectors or NBS should not be overly dependent on subsidies or public finance, but really the purpose of public investment would be to attract more investment into certain projects. Okay, so sorry. Blended finance is a term that is relatively new, but actually using mechanisms that are well known and that have been tested for a long time. Yeah. So if we take, for example, subsidized loans, I mean, it's a mechanism that has been used for quite a long time already, for maybe over 100 years. It's been used by governments to facilitate the growth of certain sectors. For example, in the automotive industry in the 50s, 60s, because it created a lot of employment, governments were trying to stimulate private car ownership by providing subsidized loan for people to acquire a new vehicle. There are also examples of subsidies being offered for companies that are orienting their production toward exports, or certain sectors that are strategic for the government. So actually those mechanisms, they are not new, but what is new and different with blended finance is basically that there are three main characteristics. So first, and I've touched upon that a little bit before, is that the aim of public investment here is to basically create an environment that is enabling additional private investment. So basically to use public investment to either de-risk project or to make a certain project more profitable. So that's something that has been used, by donor institution, but philanthropic organization, to look at what is called the leverage ratio. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude, an organization like IFC, for example, who is trying to facilitate private investment, has a ratio of 1/7, meaning that for $1 that is invested into projects, $7 of private finance can be mobilized to fill the investment gap. Yeah, so that's a very important concept in blended finance. Then, of course, that investment and that contribution of public institution should also contribute towards public goods as well. Yeah? So there needs to be an element of impact, and investment will be prioritized that drives the most social, environmental, and economic impact. Finally, as I mentioned before as well, those projects need to be financially viable, meaning that the amount of public finance that will be provided will allow actually that project to either become sufficiently profitable or to address some of the key blockages to make it actually attractive for a financial institution to invest in. So how do we look at blended finance in specific projects? So here it's interesting to look at the actual cycle of a company or a business. Most of businesses go through the same cycle, starting from a concept, an idea, and moving towards maturity, and then either decline or regrowth. So from the onset, we will have two different kinds of projects. So some projects will be too risky or too low reward for private investors. So blended finance will play very specific roles on that kind of project, and we will have projects that are maybe at a level of profitability and risk that would actually make them eligible for private finance. So for those projects that are either too risky or not profitable enough, blended finance will intervene at different stages. So first at the concept stage, so for ideas, technologies, or models, business models that are new, grants, for example, can be mobilized to support ideation and development of the concept. So that means investing, for example, in research and development, investing in feasibility studies and so on, to make sure that we can demonstrate the concept. Then there will be also, for example, concessional lending, so more favorable terms of finance for the startup phase, so to allow the project to develop from pilot to growth. And then for the facilitate component will be to look at ways to increase the profitability of projects by reducing the cost of finance. So providing loans that are maybe at a lower interest rate, or that have a longer tenure period, and so on. For projects that could be potentially commercially viable, when we're looking at new models and new basically approaches, even though those projects could be financially viable, investors will sometimes be a little bit uncomfortable with new models. Yeah. So the idea is to provide anchor investments, to provide guarantees, co-investment, and basically to reduce the perception of risk, And then in the right end of the project, so when we reach maturity, to encourage also investment in research and development, we open up access to new markets to make sure that from maturity, the project and the business can continue to grow. So two different models, and blended finance can intervene at very different stages of the business cycle. So now we can look at specific examples of blended finance, also to look at what stage of project or investment cycles they can intervene. Yeah? So the first one we can look at is catalytic grants. So it's basically a facility that would be set up to fund costs that can unlock investment. So that will be in the preparation or pre-development stage, again, to look at investment in research and development, feasibility studies, business incubation, and so on. So this would target projects that are at the concept or preparation stage or early pilot. Yeah. So the public money would here be mobilized basically to prepare the project and to make it eligible or attractive for private finance to fund it when the concept has been demonstrated. So one example that is cited here is a Blue Natural Climate Finance Facility of IUCN that will look to finance innovative projects that contribute to marine ecosystem restoration. So that's one catalytic facility that can allow basically to take an idea and to take it to the stage where it can actually become a business proposal and an idea and basically a business opportunity that is attractive for private investors. Then we can look at another mechanism that is called recoverable grants. So the idea here is that the recoverable grant will target companies that potentially can have a high impact, but that are still at a stage of development that is quite risky. So the idea here is that the grant would cover some of the highest risk activities in the project development. The grant will be repaid if the investment is successful. So it would basically demonstrate also proof of concept. And if the project has been able to repay the grant, it's a demonstration that the business model is viable and will be able to attract private investment for scaling up and replication. If the initiative is not able to generate revenues and to repay the grant, there will be no liability for the partner. So the idea here is to take a portfolio approach and to basically fund projects that have very high potential for impact, so that even if only a portion of those projects actually come to fruition, the fund will be able to demonstrate sufficient impact at scale. So one example is a global innovation fund. Okay, then we have flexible debts, which are designed basically for projects that are in implementation stage. And as we've discussed previously, one of the key issues for NBS to be financed is that sometimes the profitability, so the amount of profits that can be generated by the project will be too low for regular investment. So the idea here is to blend public and private finance to be able to propose favorable terms of lending with lower interest rate, less collateral, longer tenures, and so on, to make sure that we can actually increase profitability by reducing the cost of finance. So that's one way to increase profitability. Guarantee will be a mechanism that allows to address the other main blockage to NBS investment, which is risk. So guarantee will basically look at covering a loss that the project might incur. Yeah? So it's a way to de-risk investment and to protect the investment. And usually this is provided by organizations that have a very strong market credibility. So for example, if you have here a project that is guaranteed by the US government, it will provide enough certainty for investors to take that additional risk because they understand that the guarantee is provided by a party that will fulfill its commitment. Then sorry, we have another mechanism called matching, which is basically looking at scaling up the impact of funds, of new funds. So for example, one example is the EU Investment Fund. So the fund will look at the viability of an impact venture. It will look at whether it is structured well enough at whether the mechanism are potentially viable, and then it will match any private investment one-to-one. So for $1 of private finance going into the fund, this matching facility will match the private contribution. So it will allow to increase the scale, but also to increase the confidence. So if that public partner is investing into the fund, private investors are more likely to have confidence into the mechanism. So this was a brief overview of mechanism of blending finance that can be applied to projects. So then how do we take that to the level of a landscape? Yeah. So within a landscape, you will have activities, again, that are bankable and non-bankable, some generating income, some more focused on enabling environment. So those different projects will require a combination of public and private finance. Maybe just to give you a concrete example, so this is one example of blended finance mechanism that was implemented in Fiji with a great CRIF resilience program. So you have over 50 different local and regional stakeholders that have come around a common vision and set up a multi-stakeholder platform to facilitate investment into landscape restoration and resilience. So you have two main components to that initiative. So one that was led by WWF is focusing on mobilizing grant finance to invest in the enabling environment, in policy development, capacity building, and purely restoration project. So that actually creates an environment that enables additional private investment that is done through a facility called Matanataki, which is aiming to mobilize private investment into a pipeline of projects in sustainable fisheries, sustainable waste management, and so on. So projects that are independent from each other, that can be funded independently, but that all contribute towards a set of objectives and outcomes that have been designed under the vision and action plan of the multi-stakeholder forum. So that's a way where we can see how public investment is actually contributing to address non-bankable needs, but also to increase the confidence of the private sector to invest in bankable projects. Okay, so maybe I'll stop here. I hope it was not too fast. And now we can have a more in-depth discussion if you have any question on the mechanism or on the presentation so far. Yeah? So maybe back to you, Disha.
Great, thanks, Florian. You can stop sharing your slides for now. And then we'll bring on Paul and Lucy to join you so that we can open up for questions from the audience.
Thanks, Disha. I think we do actually have a question for Paul with regards to spatial disintegration for blended finance and how that can be used.
Yeah, that's a critical one. And, you know, the 4 returns framework is not just 4 returns, it's the 5 elements, but it's also the 3 zones. So in any landscape, you want to have at least 3 zones, one for nature, one for production, and one combined zone where you're actually regenerating nature while producing goods. So if you remember that Costa Rica landscape, you've got the natural forests, you've got the farms, but you've also got this area where you're producing coffee under shade trees and agroforestry and so on. That's regenerating nature. So really thinking about how do we expand the area for nature? How do we reduce the area for production? And how do we create more restoration in the middle of it? And that's forest landscape restoration. Does that answer the question, Lucy?
That was Peter's question. And Peter, you've got your hand raised again. Would you like to ask a follow-on question for that?
Yes, hi, Peter here. I'm from the Netherlands, and I've been working on a landscape program in Spain, where I have a small almond farm. I just wanted to interact as well on this issue that I've been raising before, which is this disintegration, because you say common lands works with 3 areas, basic areas of production of nature and the blended one. But I think it's very important to really look at, you know, the map of the intervention zone that you're considering, because there are of course a lot of blue and green corridors within the landscape as well that do not fit into a big area, but are very important for migration of plants and animal species that should be taken into consideration as well. That's why I say, you know, take a good look at the map, which I'm trying to do as well, and see where a specific finance would fit the need of larger hotspots, natural areas, but also these smaller boundary areas that are the blue and the green corridors.
That's a really important one, isn't it, Peter? Thanks. A good contribution. I mean, each farm, each forest, each factory should be thinking, how can it regenerate nature on its own property? And then the question is, how can each property connect those patches of nature to each other so that you're improving migration, your genetic connectivity, water flows, and so on. It's very hard to do that, but over time you can start to build that patchwork quilt. Obviously, you don't want to impose an area just for nature where people are. It's got to be slowly evolved from the bottom up. Thanks.
Thank you. We've got another question from Margarita from IFAD. You're directed to Paul again. If you could elaborate whether there'd be a difference between an ecosystem and a landscape approach.
That's a good question. Wow. Well,
and would this link, sorry, would this link to biomes more strategically? Would it be linked to the LDN framework? So would this, how would they linked?
I'll tell you a story of how I got to landscapes, which was back in the late 90s, just showing my age, when we started defining ecoregions and ecoregion conservation. You know, the world's nature and ecosystem services can be broken up into, I think it's about 780 terrestrial ecoregions and 200 odd marine ecoregions. So all of the many conservation organizations tried to create ecoregion conservation, just didn't work, too big. But what they realized was that if you take an ecoregion, you know, the Congo jungle or the mountains of the Andes or something like that, you can break down individual landscapes within those, and that's big enough to actually be able to work in. People see themselves inside landscapes. They can see themselves inside a catchment or within an administrative boundary or as a tribal group or something like that. And so then you can start building a full eco-regional approach, but from the landscape upwards. And an ecological landscape is one that fits with an ecosystem, a catchment or a forest area or a marine coastal area. But that's my take on it. There's probably many others as well.
Thanks, Paul. And I hope that answers your question, Margarita. And we've got another question. I think this might be more directed towards Florian, maybe looking more at the Fiji example that you gave about how would you initiate blended finance and what would be needed? You know, obviously you've presented a lot of the different types of finance that maybe would be needed at early stage or then the implementation stage, but how would you as a project go about looking to develop a more blended finance approach? What would be the steps with that?
I think, again, I mean, the financing part of a landscape approach does not stand by itself. So it's part of the wider, approach that Paul has described in the beginning, going through the 5 elements, from identifying the stakeholders, trying to look at developing a common understanding and common vision. And I think from there, it will become apparent which stakeholders have an interest in the landscape, which stakeholders are impacted, by the degradation of the landscape and would be potentially willing to either develop a project, adopt different practices, or even contribute to specific project. I think the financing strategy will be to a certain extent shaped by the stakeholder consultation process. So it's not something that we initiate, you know, in the middle of the landscape approach. It's something that comes, you know, from the design of the actual landscape vision and action plan. So that would be my take. So
something that should be threaded throughout the cycle, really, the project cycle. I think we have a hand up, David Donnelly. I think you put it down again, but if you want to come back and present your question, you're very welcome to.
Yeah. Hello, everyone, and thanks for a great presentation so far. It's very insightful. My question was that, well, from the examples given, both the projects and the financial instruments, can you give some sort of concrete examples of, concrete's the wrong word, by the way, can you give good examples of the how projects were able to convert the benefits that they were, you know, creating into, you know, financial revenue streams, such that those financial revenue streams could kind of reliably service the investments that were being made into the projects? Thank you.
Do you want to take that one, Florian? Do you want to take it?
Yeah, so concrete example. So yeah, I think Paul mentioned, for example, the Michelin project. So I think that's an interesting one because it's actually a commercial plantation. So yeah, the aim is to produce, you know, rubber in a specific landscape. But there was an additional component added to it, which meant, you know, to create a wildlife corridor and a buffer between the plantation and a national park that had been suffering a lot of encroachment. Yeah. So basically, to design the concession as, you know, the last frontier before the natural park. And I think this approach has allowed them to mobilize additional funding with very preferential terms. So they were able to develop, I think it was over $100 million green landscape bond that covered both, you know, the commercial aspect of the project, but also, you know, the funding for the development of this wildlife corridor. So I think by having, you know, this positive impact on the forest landscape, they were able to access financing that was much more favorable and that translated potentially into, you know, better commercial performance for the project. Yeah.
Thanks, Florian. I think we have another question as well, which from Lebahang. Where do we start with landscape finance? There are many degraded landscapes across Southern Africa that really need to be restored and in return conserve the community. So there are any better links of how to start? I know, Florian, you mentioned about how this process needs to be thought through right from the start when you're having, you know, stakeholder engagement and discussing how to move projects forwards. But where would you start with knowing what to finance first, where to source that finance as well?
Yeah, I think again, every project will have a different typology and a different attractiveness, level of attractiveness for different mechanisms. I think it's always easier, you know, to aggregate, you know, smaller scale projects into a pipeline, because as we often find out, it's easier to raise, you know, $1 million than $100,000. So I think one of the ideas would be to maybe in the landscape start mapping opportunities for NBS investments, and to try to see if there is a possibility to aggregate that into a group of projects that would become maybe by their scale more attractive to private and public investors. Yeah, but I think it's it's difficult to have a standardized pathway towards landscape finance. It's really again to look at you know, going through those different steps and to incubate the landscape as a whole.
Thank you.
And Lucy, maybe I can add to that. Well, what we look for are landscape partnerships, you know, the individuals and organizations who've got together with others who have a clear idea of what that problem is and are starting to think about the solution, and ideally are starting to see some ways that it can be solved in a way that can return the investment. So even out in degraded lands, dry lands, deserts, it's possible to create opportunities for people to invest in nature and climate solutions. So how to do that, and if you've got government on board, that helps. It shows that there's a high level of support, and ideally, if you've got the business sector and the finance sector on board as well, so you've talked it through with them. So I think if you're building a landscape program, get together with others, and particularly start talking with business and finance and see what they might be interested in. You don't need a lot of money for that. The next stage actually is quite difficult, getting the design money, and then after, it's easier to get the 100 million than the 100,000, but much easier to just get started.
I think that feeds into this question from James about suggesting that perhaps the landscape approach should focus more on interdependency and common issues to be effective in practice, which I think very much builds on your comments. Another question from Carolyn, if it's possible to have a list of organisations offering landscape financing for rural-based restoration efforts, then that are also supporting market linkages as well to products arising from restoration. And is that something that's available or considering being developed? Would that be, you think, be a useful thing? Or do you think because this is very contextualized, context specific, it might be sort of, what's the right word? Creating confusion, I suppose, because not one solution is going to fit all of these.
We're actually trying to set up a platform for referring people to the right sort of help. The 1,000 Landscapes platform, I'll put it in the chat box in a second. That's with a whole range of different organisations who are combining forces, and they're organisations that work on agriculture, conservation, and many other things. But Lucy, FAO has quite a few resources as well. So this might be a place that you can give a plug.
Yes, no, and we have some publications. I know some were in the presentation as well about local financing and what does this finance mean on the ground. It doesn't necessarily list the finance, but I think it builds on your presentation, Florian, about what type of finance is needed for different stages and what does that mean on the ground, to local people. And other sort of developments that we're working on as well is how to build bankable business projects. And from the FAO side, we have e-learning courses that people are welcome to dip into. I know some of them will be part of this challenge and future challenges that we're doing as introduction to restoration, introduction to financing, and one later in the year for introduction to building bankable business plans and step-by-steps to how to support that. And also as well for people who want more information with all of this, there is, if people aren't already members of the D group, this community of practice that we're building for finance for restoration, please do join. I know that the information to join will be put into the chat, but any further information that you'd like on that, please don't hesitate to contact us with that. But yes, there are a number of resources available, but I think it is important to emphasize that each project, each landscape will have such specific needs and the institutions associated with that, and legislation that's available or perhaps needs to be developed that should be considered as well, rather than sort of a step-by-step, this is press go and off you go with that. I think we have one final question, I think, before we go into our discussion groups, again from Peter, with regards to private sector investment, how to calculate the rate of return on certain landscapes interventions, how to make those interesting for investors, especially when you're talking about agroforestry, and whether there are landscape funds that provide preparation grants for landscape projects as well. Florian, perhaps with the private sector that you might be able to follow up on that, and Paul with the preparation grants.
Yeah, so I think there are different ways to look at the return of investment. Yeah, so one is to focus on the financial returns, and one is to look at the total economic value that the investment will generate. And there are different tools that are available for that. So one of them that is often mentioned, for example, in the design of nature-based solutions, is to look at a cost-benefit analysis. So the idea is to look at what would happen if that investment did not take place. And with that additional investment in NBS, what would be the additionality? So what would be the incremental benefit that would derive from the investment? And then again, it links to the discussion previously on natural capital, is can we actually put a value on ecosystem services, to look at the whole set of benefits. So not only the financial benefit, but what would be the benefit on access to livelihood, access to clean water, access to green jobs, and so on. So I think there are different ways to look at, to define first and to look at impact. And I think what is important when we look at landscape planning is that part of the, the collective action and visioning will be to look at what are the key KPIs that those stakeholders want to achieve in the landscape. Yeah. So it can be, hectares of forest under conservation. It can be jobs created. So I think it depends on how do you actually define success and how do you go about measuring impact towards that vision. So you can look at impact at project level, but you can also look at impact, cumulative impact from different investments for the same landscape, like is the case, for example, for Matanataki.
I think following up on that, I think there are a couple of questions that are linked to the second question about landscape funds that provide preparation grants. Does the GEF perhaps provide such finance under their financing structures? And are there grants for multiple stakeholder partnership dialogues on landscape restorations relating to the Sahel? I know from the, with regards to the Vanuatu example that we gave, the initial funding was to support the development of this forest and landscape restoration strategy, which was the initial then starting point to then access the much larger adaptation fund finance that will be moving the project forward and increasing the scale across the country as well. So there are some elements from finance that can support that as well. I don't know, Paul, if you want to jump in with any examples from your side.
Yeah, there's a whole series of different funds. It depends on the location and the circumstances and what you're trying to do. Better to have a conversation directly about that. And we do need a matchmaker. We do need to have these all on a single platform, don't we? So that you can easily just go through and find what's coming up and what fits your needs.
Thank you. I think we've got time for just one more question. What role do SMEs play in all of this, and how important is an SME acceleration program in landscape approach work?
Do you want to take that, Florian?
Yeah, I couldn't hear that. Sorry, could you please repeat the question?
I'll repeat. What role do SMEs, small medium enterprises, play in all of this approach, and how important are they how important is an SME acceleration program in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, when we look at the landscape, we will have different economic actors ranging from large plantation, large factories, but also smaller structures. So independent smallholder farmers, but also, village cooperatives, village businesses, and all have a role to play in that landscape plan, and all can be recipient also on funding. So I think there is a lot of work to do, for example, improving the capacity of village cooperatives, working with smallholder farmers, integrating them into supply chains. So this can be done working with big players. This can also be done working with companies that are focused on niche markets, responsible sourcing, and so on. So I think definitely the SMEs are part of the network and ecosystem of companies operating in the landscape, and they do have an important role to play as contributors, but also as beneficiaries of landscape investment.
Perfect. Well, if there are any more, I don't think there are any more questions. So Margarita's clarified that GEF funding doesn't directly provide funds for the initial idea, only for the full project design after the initial idea is approved. So that's been useful to know. But I think going forward, there will be time for a few more questions within your discussion groups. Wonderful. So just a final summary from all of today's presentations from Paul and Florian as well. I think we've identified that there's this real challenge to meet this urgency to restore degraded forests and landscapes, and that it really needs this holistic approach to looking at not just financial returns, but to generate this much wider four returns of inspiration, social capital, natural capital, and financial capital. And these investments at this landscape scale require defining the problem and identifying the different solutions to determine the financial needs for all of the different stakeholders on the ground. And we've identified that the 5 elements approach, looking at landscape partnerships, identifying a common understanding, vision and action plan, taking action, and impact and learning, can all support how to identify the problem and clarify the solution. And while obtaining finance and all the resources needed for that is most likely to occur during the vision and the taking action stage, the financial requirements and solutions to those should also be considered throughout this process. But also identifying that different stages of restoration will require different financial investments depending on the risk-return ratio for investors, as well as the enabling environment of projects and programs. And so we've been looking at how to meet these challenges. Blended finance can attract greater private investment with providing these incentives, provide to flow into nature-based solutions, projects and landscapes, and also can spread this burden of risk between public funders and private investors, while also coordinating financial instruments throughout this FLR process. And I think we've learned a lot from all of those, contributing to the discussions about other key elements that sort of would be needed to be considered through that process, where to fit producer organisations, how to look at these incentives, looking at the different enabling environments and what legislation might be supporting. But I think understanding the landscape and the needs through these 4 returns and 5 elements approach can really support identifying financial needs with that.